In the popular imagination, ancient Egypt is a place of golden splendor, of pyramids and perfume, of goddesses walking among men and queens who commanded armies. Cleopatra, Nefertiti, Hatshepsut, names wrapped in mystery and admiration. And, for a fleeting moment, you might believe that being a woman in ancient Egypt was a life of privilege, respect, and power. But that image is a mirage. A beautiful one, no doubt, but a mirage nonetheless. Tonight, we begin a journey through the veil of sand and time, and as we peel back each dusty layer, you'll see the truth behind the myths, the aching, often invisible weight carried by Egyptian women, from the bustling streets of Thebes to the shadowy chambers of village homes. Welcome to the quiet struggle of being born into a world that praised goddesses, yet punished women. The mirage of equality. To the outsider, ancient Egypt may have seemed unusually progressive for its time. Women could own property, initiate divorce, even run businesses in, rare cases, statues of female deities towered beside male gods. This has led many to believe Egypt was a bastion of early gender equality. But here's the twist. Legal rights on papyrus didn't always translate into freedoms in the dusty alleys and mud brick homes of everyday life. Much like a beautifully painted tomb, ornate on the outside, suffocating within, the outward appearance concealed the hardship underneath. Women were born into a social script. Their path was laid out in roles rather than choices. Daughter, wife, mother, widow, and unlike their stone-carved queens, most never escaped these roles, not without cost. The birth lottery, imagine being born as a girl in 1300 BCE. The midwife whispers your sex to your mother, who forces a smile while your father says nothing, at all. In rural villages, another mouth to feed meant another small body to labor in the fields by the time she could walk. In wealthier households, she might be groomed for an arranged marriage by the age of 10. Even birth rituals were marked, with quiet injustice. Amulets to protect newborn boys were carved in abundance, while those for girls were smaller, cheaper, sometimes forgotten altogether. Superstition, you see, already began its slow work. Boys were educated, often at temples or with scribes. Girls, they learned to keep house and keep quiet. Their minds were trained not in mathematics or astronomy, but in domestic silence, embroidering linens they would one day bleed onto after childbirth. The weight of purity. From the earliest years, a young girl's value became entangled with a single word, purity. Not just spiritual, but bodily. Virginity, obedience, modesty, these were her currencies. But this purity wasn't empowering. It was a chain. There were no coming-of-age ceremonies celebrating a girl's intelligence or strength. Instead, menstruation marked her as ready to marry, ready to bear children, ready to be spoken about but rarely spoken to. And if she lost her virginity outside marriage, whether by choice or by force, it mattered little. Her worth was damaged, her marriage prospects gone. It was not uncommon for a family to quietly send away such a girl to a temple or relative's home, out of sight, out of shame, a god for every role, but none for escape. The Egyptian pantheon offered a goddess for every feminine role. Hathor for love and joy, Isis for motherhood, Bastet for protection. Women prayed fervently, knelt in temples, left offerings, by candlelight. But the gods never promised liberation. Religion in ancient Egypt upheld the very structures that confined women. Sacred texts taught that a woman's highest purpose was to bear and raise children, to be the fertile vessel through which the divine order could be maintained. Even the great goddess Isis, praised for her magical powers, was most venerated for her loyalty to her slain husband Osiris and her motherhood of Horus. In myth and life alike, a woman's power was praised when it was in service to others, to husband, to son, to the state. Behind closed doors, there is no hieroglyph for pain, not the kind felt in silence. We know from fragmented scrolls and letters that many women lived in fear behind closed doors. abuse from husbands or masters was common and largely invisible. A woman could, in theory, appeal to local officials. But how often would a woman risk shame, retaliation, or exile to do so? The village walls were thick, the ears thin. A scream might travel down a narrow street in Memphis or Giza and find no answer. And then there were the childbirths, frequent, grueling, dangerous. With little medical understanding and no anesthesia, childbirth was a gamble between life and death. Women buried daughters beside them far more often than they buried sons. Midwives were not doctors. They were companions in suffering, the legacy of silence. As the Nile carried papyrus scrolls downriver and priests chanted in golden halls, few chronicled the everyday woman, her thoughts, her dreams, her private agonies. But in the margins of tombs, hidden among graffiti scrawled by stonecutters, and in the worn fingerprints on household pottery, her story lingers. A whisper under the roar of kings and gods. Tonight, we begin to give her voice. Close your eyes and imagine a narrow mud-brick home, its single window covered by tattered linen. Inside, a girl no older than 7 sits cross-legged beside her mother, kneading flour into dough. Her hands are small, roughened already by years of mimicking adult chores. She does not yet know what womanhood means, but she is already living its burdens. This is what it meant to be a girl in ancient Egypt. Not royalty, not a goddess, just a daughter of dust, born to serve, survive, and be silent. The early years play beneath the gaze of responsibility. Childhood was brief. For boys, there was more time to explore, to run near the riverbanks, to carve tiny wooden boats and race them along irrigation canals. But girls, their play was always watched, always fenced in by invisible walls. Even their toys, if they had any, foreshadowed their futures. Tiny clay cooking pots, miniature dolls dressed as brides, carved animals to pretend feed. It was preparation, not play. Fun, but never free. By the age of 5 or 6, many girls were expected to help with housework, sweeping floors, grinding grain, carrying water from the well. Their small hands clutched jars heavier than their hopes. The Nile gave life to the Yi land, but for girls it gave labor, and yet there was beauty. The same child might pause while fetching water and gaze at the sky, tracing the flight of an ibis. She might hum a lullaby to a sibling while rocking a cradle. She learned early how to soothe pain, how to be quiet and needed in equal measure. Education, a privilege denied boys of noble families, learned to read and write. They studied with scribes, memorized the instructions of Ptahhotep, recited prayers in temples. But girls, rarely. In theory, a wealthy family could hire a tutor for their daughter, but most did not. Education was seen as unnecessary, sometimes even dangerous. What good was a literate wife? Who needed a daughter who could question instructions? For peasant girls, the idea of schooling was laughable. They were born into a life of endless work, and school was for someone else's son. Instead, girls were taught domestic skills, how to bake without measuring, how to mend clothes with bone needles, how to stay quiet when elders spoke, how to know shame before they understood why it was expected of them. A brilliant mind might flicker behind curious eyes, but it had no parchment to write on, no ink to give it voice. Clothing the body and controlling it. As a girl aged, her body became a source of tension. Nudity in children was common and accepted in early years, especially in the summer heat. But by the time a girl reached 9 or 10, that changed. Suddenly, her skin was watched. Her limbs were covered. She was expected to wear linen shifts, modest and simple. Jewelry was permitted, if her family could afford it, but always with a subtext, decoration for future possession. Even hairstyles marked transition. A young girl might wear a sidelock of youth, one long braid hanging from an otherwise shaved head. But as she neared puberty, Her hair would be grown, styled, oiled. She was being made ready, not for herself, but for others. For marriage, for motherhood, for trade. Her body, once her own, was becoming a public investment. Friendships and secrets. In quiet corners of courtyards and kitchens, girls formed bonds with each other. They whispered secrets behind woven baskets, giggled over the attention of a neighbor's son, shared fears about first blood. These moments, unscripted and unrecorded, were fleeting sanctuaries. In a world that defined them by their utility, friendships gave girls a rare sense of belonging beyond role. But even this came with limits. Jealousies could erupt when one girl was betrothed before another. Rumors could spread. A misstep, a misunderstood word, could bring shame upon an entire family. Gossip was both currency and weapon. Sisterhood was powerful, but always fragile. The first blood, a turning point puberty, was not a celebration. It was a warning bell. The first period signaled not independence, but obligation. A girl was now ripe. That word, used often in ancient texts, reflects exactly how society saw her. Like fruit, ready to be picked, consumed, possessed. No longer was she allowed to run barefoot or laugh too loudly. Her chores increased. Her mother became more watchful. Her father began quiet conversations with neighbors about potential husbands. For some, this came at 12. For others, as early as 10. And once her cycle began, so too did the countdown. To marriage, often arranged without her input, and sometimes to men twice her age. Painful rites mark this transition. Herbal baths, incense rituals, quiet prayers to Hathor or Isis. Her childhood had ended, and her voice, if it ever had one, began to dim. Unspoken fears. There were things girls were warned about, and things no one spoke of. She knew to avoid strange men in alleyways. She was told never to meet a boy's eyes too long, but no one told her what to do if it happened anyway. If someone touched her, hurt her, stole something she didn't yet have the words for. There were no laws that truly protected her, no safe houses, no judges who listened. A violation of her body brought shame. On her, not her attacker. She might be sent away to a temple as a weaver, or hidden in another village with a relative. Her life, altered permanently by a man's whim, would be rewritten as a story of dishonor. She would carry that stain forever. The promise of nothing. And so, the young girl grew, day by day, into a role she never chose. She learned to carry baskets and burdens, to smile politely at older men, to accept gifts as unspoken contracts, to cry quietly at night when no one could hear. What did she dream of? A kind husband, a home with less shouting, a baby that lived. Perhaps. But perhaps she dreamed of a life with fewer rules, of walking by the Nile without fear, of learning to write her name in ink, of telling her own story rather than being told who she was. She would never say it aloud, but as she watched the water flow under the moonlight, her eyes might betray it. A flicker of rebellion, a whisper of self. By the time a girl in ancient Egypt reached 12 or 13, childhood was over. Her worth was no longer measured in laughter or curiosity, but in dowries and expectations. She was entering the marriage market, a quiet transaction wrapped in ritual, custom, and control. The word market is not a mistake, because for all its tradition and sacred rites, marriage in ancient Egypt was often a trade. A girl was not so much asked to love as she was assigned to fulfill, a transaction between families, brokered by fathers and confirmed by silence. The age of marriage, early, eager, and unfair. Most Egyptian girls were married by the age of 14, some even earlier, especially in rural villages, where another working pair of hands or womb was deemed urgent. A girl's menstruation was a signal, not of personal transformation, but of economic readiness. It's important to remember that life expectancy was lower in ancient Egypt, often around 35 to 40 years. A girl who married at 12 could be a mother by 13, a widow by 20, and dead by 30. And yet, this accelerated timeline was never questioned. It was the rhythm of life, the expectation. Men, on the other hand, typically married in their 20s or even later. A 15-year age gap was not unusual. The power imbalance began at the altar and widened with time. The arrangement. Love had nothing to do with it. Unlike the romantic notions we sometimes attach to marriage today, Egyptian unions, especially among commoners, were practical affairs. The fathers arranged the match. The mothers prepared the daughter. The terms were discussed. What land would be shared? What dowry would be offered? Was the girl healthy, fertile, submissive? No ceremony in the temples was needed. Marriage in Egypt was often informal in legal terms, recognized by cohabitation, property sharing, and mutual acknowledgement. But the social expectations were formal indeed. Everyone knew their role. The girl might cry the night before. Her mother might whisper that she too had cried once and survived. The daughter might ask, "Will he be kind?" And the mother, after a pause, would say only, "Do your duty." Dowries and commodification. A dowry in ancient Egypt wasn't just gold or goods. It was a statement, a transfer of value. The bride's family might offer linen, oil, cattle, or slaves, depending on their wealth. The husband, in turn, offered a bride price, known as the satbar, a form of payment for taking the woman into his household. This wasn't romantic, it was accounting, and it made the woman feel, perhaps for the first time, like property. Rich families bartered for alliances, for land, for influence. Poor families often married off daughters to reduce mouths to feed. The girl rarely got to say no. Consent was assumed, expected, not sought. The wedding day. Quiet submission. There were no white gowns, no temple bells, no crowds of flowers and music. A girl might move from her father's home to her husband's with little more than a bag of clothes and a basket of offerings. In wealthier households, there might be a feast. In poorer ones, perhaps only a small gathering of neighbors. The bride was veiled, figuratively or literally, not to celebrate mystery, but to signify her submission. Her body now belonged elsewhere. Her name would be spoken less in her father's home and more in whispered gossip. Behind her new door, no legal vows, no recorded promises. And yet, the expectation was unbreakable. Obey, bear children, keep the home. Power. Behind the walls, within her new household, a woman might have limited authority, depending on her husband's mood, her in-laws, or the number of children she bore. If she was lucky, her husband treated her with basic respect. If she was lucky, his mother didn't hate her. If she was lucky, she gave birth to a son early. Luck, in this case, was a fragile shield. The law technically allowed for women to own property, even to divorce. But in practice, these rights were rarely used unless the woman had strong family backing or extraordinary courage. Many wives were watched, controlled, corrected, and if they failed to please their husbands, there was no safety net. Polygamy, concubines, and competition. Though monogamy was common among lower classes, wealthier men often kept multiple wives or concubines. A first wife might find herself sharing space, affection, and status with a younger, more favoured newcomer. This bred tension, jealousy, quiet warfare inside the home. Women who should have been allies often became rivals, forced to compete for security and favour. Children from different mothers complicated inheritance. Affection became a resource to be won. In such a home, a woman could lose everything, not because of what she did, but because someone newer arrived. Even in smaller households, a husband could seek pleasure elsewhere without consequence. A wife, never. Her fidelity was sacred, his, optional. Escape was rare, and costly divorce was allowed. A woman could, in theory, leave a husband if he abused her or failed to provide. But reality was more brutal. A divorced woman often returned to her father's home in shame. If her parents were dead or unwilling, she might live alone, vulnerable to predators and poverty. And what of her children? In most cases, they stayed with the father. A mother who left risked not only her dignity, but her children's futures. So she stayed, she endured, she smiled when needed. She learned silence as both armor and prison. A life promised to another. And so it was that girls were promised, prepared, and passed along. Love was a hope, not an expectation. Happiness? A fortunate byproduct, never a requirement. They learned to read their husband's moods like the Nile's tides, to pour wine with just the right grace, to bear pain without showing it, to be useful before they were even known. And somewhere deep inside, buried beneath duty, obedience, and habit, a sliver of the girl remained, the one who once traced birds across the sky, the one who once asked, "Will he be kind?" She never got an answer, but she never stopped asking. Becoming a mother in ancient Egypt was not just expected, it was demanded. It was the single most honored and most dangerous role a woman could occupy. But in a land that worshipped fertility goddesses and prayed to Isis for protection, the reality behind motherhood was far from divine. For the women who bore Egypt's future, childbirth was a gauntlet, a silent war fought without medicine, without mercy, and without certainty of survival. Every birth could be your last. Every cradle could become a coffin. The burden of expectation. From the moment a woman was married, she was expected to conceive. Quickly. To delay was to invite judgment, whispers, even rejection. A wife who did not become pregnant within a year, or was often blamed, even if her husband was the problem. Infertility was considered a woman's failure, not nature's quirk. She might be sent to temples to pray, made to drink foul herbal mixtures, or subjected to old midwives' rituals, none of which truly worked. Her worth was tied to her womb, and her identity dissolved into a single role, mother-to-be. Even in moments of intimacy, she was not sought for love, but for function. A vessel, a hope for a male heir. The anatomy of danger. Childbirth in ancient Egypt was performed in the home, usually on a special birth bricks platform. The woman would squat or kneel, gripping ropes or another woman's hands. There were no hospitals, no trained doctors, only midwives, experienced, yes, but helpless against hemorrhage, infection, or obstructed labor. Pain relief was nearly non-existent. Some women chewed on papyrus dipped in honey or wine. Others clutched charms or amulets shaped like bears, the protective dwarf god. But these were comforts, not cures. Mortality rates were terrifyingly high. 1 in 10 births could result in the mother's death, infection, blood loss, or retained placenta. Any of these could quietly end her life, and quickly. Still, she labored. Because to refuse, or to fear too openly, was to be accused of weakness. The stillness. After birth, and what if the mother survived? The danger wasn't over. The first days after childbirth were riddled with risks. Fever, retained afterbirth, torn tissue. Sepsis was a silent killer, creeping in during the night. But worse, perhaps, was the stillborn. Ancient Egyptian graves are full of tiny coffins, infants who never cried, children who never walked. Some archaeologists have found burial jars with 2 small bones wrapped together, twins, lost before their first breath. Infant mortality was brutally high. Nearly half of all children died before reaching 5 years old. And mothers, they kept giving birth, again and again and again. Because if one child died, another was expected. A healthy mother was a perpetual vessel. There was no time for grief, only obligation. Rituals of protection in an attempt to shield both mother and child, Egyptians turned to the gods. Women gave birth under the protection of Taweret, the hippo-headed goddess of childbirth, and Bes, the dwarf with a lion's mane who warded off evil. Amulets were placed near the birthing bricks, small carvings tucked into bedding, chants whispered during contractions. Yet these rituals, however tender or hopeful, were ultimately powerless against biology. The Nile gave life, yes, but it also bred disease, parasites, and malnutrition. And these threats cared little for prayer. Still, women clung to ritual. It gave them comfort when control was impossible. The role of midwives, the midwife, usually, an older, experienced woman, was both healer and witness. She carried with her herbal knowledge passed down orally. She knew how to rub a belly with oil, how to reposition a baby if it was breech, how to deliver by moonlight with only flickering lamps to guide her. But she also knew when a woman would not survive, when the cries would stop, when the bleeding wouldn't. She could do nothing but stay, pray, and watch. Sometimes she would clean the mother's body before anyone else saw her, wrap her limbs, close her eyes, and then return to her own home, ready to do it all again for another neighbor the next week. Motherhood doesn't end with birth. Those who survived childbirth entered a new crucible, the endless labor of motherhood. New. Mothers were expected to nurse their babies themselves. Wet nurses existed, but only for the wealthy or for women who had lost milk due to stress, injury, or death. For the poor, there was no backup. Women carried their babies in slings while grinding grain or fetching water. They breastfed while kneeling in the dirt. They slept light, woke often, and worked always. Illness was constant. Food was sparse. If a child developed a fever or a cough, there was little that could be done. Medicine was rudimentary. Poultices, incense and prayer, and when a child died there was no therapy, no comfort, only another mouth waiting to be fed. Another child to bear, the emotional landscape. Joy and terror. It is tempting to imagine ancient Egyptian mothers as hardened by repetition. But they were not stone. They loved, they feared, they hoped. A mother might sing softly to her child at night, telling him stories of Ra crossing the sky. She might make a toy from linen scraps, or carve a tiny cat for luck. She might look into the infant's eyes and wonder, just for a moment, who they might become, before life took them too. Soon they grieved in private, sometimes alone, sometimes while still bleeding, because grief was considered dangerous for a woman. It was said to invite demons. So she smiled, or pretended to, and then she got pregnant again. Legacy in the shadows. Ancient records rarely speak of these mothers. They focus on kings, gods, wars, and crops. But their fingerprints remain on the pottery, the homes, the worn birthing bricks buried beneath collapsed homes. They were the true builders of Egypt, the silent engines of life. Without their pain, Egypt's grand temples would never have had priests. Its armies would never have marched. Its pharaohs would never have been born. And yet, their suffering went largely unrecorded. Their tears soaked into soil, not scrolls. They lived and died in service to life, but their own lives, forgotten. In a civilization that revered scribes, worshipped gods with long chants, and etched language into stone, a woman's voice was often the one thing not meant to echo. She could speak, but not too loudly. She could question, but only in private. Her voice was not her own. It belonged to her husband, her family, her community's decorum. To be loud was to be noticed, and to be noticed was to risk everything. Words as power, denied in. Ancient Egypt, literacy was power. The ability to read and write was not just a skill, it was the gateway to influence. Scribes held status equal to priests, sometimes higher. They recorded laws, told stories, preserved religion. And yet, almost no women were trained as scribes. There are rare exceptions, elite priestesses, or daughters of scribes who learned the craft secretly. But for the vast majority of women, hieroglyphs were a foreign tongue. Words danced before them on temple walls and papyrus scrolls, but they were not invited to join the dance. To speak was one thing, to record was another. Without the pen, a woman's voice could never outlive her body. The expectations of modesty. Modesty in ancient Egypt was not just about clothing, it was about demeanor. A virtuous woman was expected to be gentle in tone, subdued in public, and utterly deferential to men. Her voice should soothe, not stir. A woman who spoke too freely was branded boisterous, loose, or worse. If she disagreed with her husband openly, she could be seen as rebellious. If she debated in the marketplace, she risked being mocked or excluded. If she confronted a priest, she risked blasphemy. The safest women were those who nodded. The cleverest learned to say everything without seeming to speak at all. Gossip, the double-edged tongue in private, among other women, voices bloomed. Kitchens, bathhouses, and weaving circles were where secrets slipped and judgments sharpened. Gossip was the only currency many women possessed. It could elevate someone or destroy her. A whispered rumor could make a mother-in-law sympathetic or turn a neighbor into an outcast. Stories passed mouth to mouth became legends in their own right, no less powerful than what priests read from scrolls. And yet, even here, there was danger. Gossip too sharp could be traced back. A woman accused of stirring discord might be punished, not with legal force, but with exile from her community, shunned, unseen. Her voice, once a tool, could become a trap. Silence in the home. Within the walls of her house, a woman's words could be her salvation or her downfall. A respectful wife was silent during a husband's anger. She did not interrupt. She apologized quickly. If beaten, she kept quiet so neighbors wouldn't hear. If neglected, she blamed herself. To complain was to shame the household. To protest abuse was to dishonor the family. Even mothers taught their daughters that silence was safety. The walls of Egyptian homes were thick, not just of clay and straw, but of unspoken rules. Sound carried judgment, and silence was armor. But silence also left bruises unseen and wounds unhealed. The temple's echoes women were allowed in temples, but mostly as worshippers, not leaders. While men chanted, read, and held rituals, women stood behind. They offered food, incense, flowers. Their prayers were quiet, their gestures rehearsed. Some women did rise to religious prominence, chantresses, dancers, priestesses. In Thebes, the position of God's wife of Amun became a prestigious title reserved for royal women. But even these exceptions were rare, symbolic more than practical, and none of them changed the larger truth. Women were vessels of devotion, not voices of doctrine. In the eyes of the gods, perhaps, women were equal, but in the voice of the state, they were echoes only. Motherhood, the one role where speech was safe. The only time a woman's voice held unquestioned power was with her children. She taught them to walk, to speak, to obey. Her lullabies carried stories older than the pyramids. Her warnings about snakes, strangers and spirits were as trusted as a priest's sermon. In these fleeting years, her speech shaped the next generation. Boys listened until they didn't. Girls listened and learned when to stop speaking themselves. A mother's voice was both comfort and command, but as her sons grew, even they began to speak over her, to correct her, to decide for her. What had once been law in their childhood became suggestion in her old age. Love letters never sent. Sometimes a woman fell in love, not arranged, not assigned. Real, dangerous love. There are fragments of ancient poems written by women, or perhaps imagined from their perspective. They speak of longing, of stolen glances, of aching for a touch. But these were rare. Love was not something women were encouraged to talk about, especially not to men. To confess desire was to risk being labeled shameless. To express unhappiness in marriage was betrayal. And so, women wrote love letters in their heads. They carved heartache into their daily chores. They whispered secrets to the riverbanks or the wind, and they stayed quiet. The legacy of quiet. Women history remembers queens, the ones who ruled beside kings or in their absence. Nefertari, Hatshepsut, Cleopatra. But what of the woman who whispered bedtime stories beside the Nile? What of the girl who learned to be silent before she learned to speak? What of the mother whose words died with her, never written, never carved, never kept? These women, voiceless in their time, now speak only through fragments, broken pottery, faded paintings, the soft wear of a loom. But if we listen closely, they are still there, in the quiet corners of history, in the silences between the hieroglyphs. The ancient Egyptian household was the heart of life for most women, but it was also their cage. It was where they loved, labored, prayed, birthed, and wept. The world might see her as a wife, a mother, a servant to the home. But within those walls, the details of her existence unfolded in patterns so small they almost vanished into dust. To the outside world, she was invisible, but inside the home, she carried everything. The architecture of her world-most Egyptian homes, especially among commoners, were small, modest structures of mud brick. They usually consisted of 1 or 2 rooms, sometimes a courtyard, and maybe a rooftop used for sleeping during hot nights. There were no private bedrooms, no soft chairs, no space just for her. The home was not a sanctuary, it was a workplace. The floor was hard, the air thick with dust and the scent of boiling lentils. Walls were bare, save for a few faded amulets and clay lamps. If she was lucky, she had a place to sit in the shade during the noonday heat. If not, she labored through it. The house was not hers. It belonged to her husband or her father, but she was expected to maintain it perfectly. The endless chores, a woman's work in the household, never truly stopped. At dawn, she lit the fire. She baked bread, grinding grain by hand with stones, a task that wore her knees and palms raw over time. She fetched water from wells or canals, sometimes walking miles. She prepared every meal, cleaned every surface, patched every linen, and soothed every child. And when the sun set and her family lay down to rest, she might stay up longer still, mending sandals, braiding baskets, or nursing a sick infant. No one wrote songs about her labor. No one carved her story into stone. But without her, nothing functioned. Roles within the home. Each woman's role inside the household was defined by her status, but no role was ever light. A young wife answered to her husband and his mother. A mother answered to her sons as they aged. A widow might have slightly more freedom, but usually with more grief and less help. In multi-generational homes, hierarchies were rigid. Elders expected deference. Younger women competed for space, authority, and peace. The home could be a battlefield of glances, whispered orders, and veiled tensions. If she had daughters, she trained them to follow in her steps, not because she wanted to, but because she knew they had no other choice. Furnishing the invisible. Though poor homes were simple, a woman's touch shaped every detail. She spun flax into linen by hand. She dyed threads with crushed berries and earth pigments. She shaped clay into cooking pots and adorned them with crude patterns, not to impress others, but to feel some flicker of pride. She tended tiny garden plots or raised pigeons for food. She taught her daughters the recipes passed, down from memory, not from books. The household might be small, but it held her entire life's work, and though it wasn't praised, it was essential. It kept the rhythm of the family, even as it eroded her spirit. The kitchen, her domain of control. The kitchen was the one space she ruled, however modest it was. There was no oven, just a clay, hearth on the floor, where she cooked over wood or dung. She knew every jar of lentils, every bundle of garlic, every piece of salted fish. Cooking was an act of survival. It was also one of the few ways she could express care, creativity, or control. A well-cooked dish might ease her husband's anger. A sweetened fig cake might make her child laugh. And when she was alone, the rhythm of stirring and crushing might offer her a moment of peace. A small, sacred silence. The roof, her skyward escape. In many homes, the rooftop served as a refuge, especially for women. Here, under open sky, she might spin thread, dry laundry, or simply sit in stillness. At night, she might escape the heat of the house and sleep beside her children, staring at stars she'd never reach. Sometimes, other women from nearby rooftops would whisper to each other in the dark, sharing quiet companionship across alleyways. It was the only place she could speak freely, sometimes even laugh. On the roof, she was not watched by men. She could be herself, if only for a little while. The house of sickness. The home was also where women endured illness, both theirs and others. There were no physicians for common women. If she fell ill, she kept working unless her body collapsed. Her husband might summon a local healer, but only if the illness became severe. More often, she treated her family with herbs, poultices, and hope. She stayed awake through fevers, wiped sweat from her children's brows, whispered prayers to Isis. If a child died, the home became a tomb. She still had to clean it, still had to cook in it, still had to wake the next morning. Grief was no excuse for neglect. Her burial begins at home. In a bitter twist of fate, many women spent their final days in the very space they had given their lives to maintain. If she died in childbirth, she died where she had labored. If she died old and exhausted, she did so in the corner where she used to sing. And sometimes, she wasn't buried in a tomb, but in a simple pit beside the home, marked only by stones. There were no long funerary processions, no golden sarcophagi. Only the memory of her labor, carried quietly by her daughters, passed into repetition. Her death marked no pause in household routine, only a moment of silence. And then, another woman picked up the broom. It's often said that women in ancient Egypt had more rights than their counterparts in other ancient civilizations. On paper, that's true. They could own property, they could inherit wealth, they could make wills. And yet, for the vast majority of Egyptian women, these rights were more theory than practice, more illusion than reality. Ownership in ancient Egypt was wrapped in rules, customs, and the shadow of patriarchy. A woman might hold a deed, but she didn't always hold power. Property. On papyrus legally, women in ancient Egypt could own land, homes, slaves, jewelry, and livestock. They could inherit from their parents or receive dowries. Some even ran businesses, usually inherited from husbands or fathers. But the catch was this: legal ownership meant little if it wasn't backed by male support. A woman's claim to property often depended on whether her husband allowed it, whether her sons respected it, or whether a male scribe would record it truthfully. Documents were written, yes, but they were often witnessed, interpreted, and upheld by men. The courts were male, the scribes were male, the land assessors also male. So, while a woman could own a vineyard, she needed her brother's name on the boundary stone to avoid disputes. Her freedom was still fenced in. The dowry illusion. A dowry was often seen as a woman's property. Linen, gold, livestock, land, or even servants brought into the marriage from her family. In theory, this remained hers, meant to support her if the marriage ended. But in reality, the husband usually managed it. He could use her linen to trade, her land to plant, her servants as labor. If the marriage ended amicably, or if the woman had powerful family ties, she might reclaim it. But if she was cast out or widowed without sons, her claim was weak. Dowries were not keys to freedom. They were more like quiet bets against future suffering. Inheritance, a game of proximity. Inheritance laws in ancient Egypt allowed women to inherit from parents, husbands, and even children. A mother could receive her son's property if he died. A daughter could inherit if there were no sons. But hierarchy mattered. Sons always came first. Daughters only inherited if no male heir was available, or if the father explicitly named her in a will. And even then, her share could be challenged. A jealous brother, a new husband, a corrupted scribe, a woman might watch her inheritance vanish in court before she ever touched it. Justice, like land, flowed in the direction of the strongest. Widows, power and precariousness. Widowhood was a paradox. It could mean sudden independence or sudden vulnerability. If a woman outlived her husband and had sons, she might manage the household until the eldest son came of age. She might control property, manage labor, even negotiate small trades. But without sons, she was often at the mercy of in-laws or male relatives. She could be displaced, remarried, or quietly ignored. Even wealthy widows weren't safe. A neighbor's accusation, a forged contract, or a greedy nephew could strip her of everything. Her security depended not on her property, but on how much her community respected her. Wills and final wishes. Some women left wills. These documents, rare but powerful, show women bequeathing land, goods, and jewelry to children or temples. They offer a glimpse of agency, of final attempts to speak beyond death. But even these wills could be contested, and often were. A woman's final wishes could be overturned if a male heir argued she had been coerced or confused. The court might rule in his favor, and her carefully worded bequest would be erased like chalk on stone. She could write her will, in ink. But the ink dried only if a man let it. The marketplace. Mythsome historians cite evidence of women running shops or participating in local markets. Bakers, weavers, perfumers. This, too, is used as proof of Egyptian women's economic freedom. And indeed, some did. But most of these women were widows, priestesses, or elite wives with spare capital. Common women in marketplaces were more often workers than owners, selling goods made at home, not managing profits. Their earnings were meager, and they returned every coin to the household. The myth of the independent businesswoman was true for a few, but not for the many. Temples and trusts, in rare cases, especially in temple towns, women served as administrators or stewards. The position of God's wife of Amun in Thebes even allowed royal women to control temple wealth and lands. But this was deeply political, less about women's empowerment and more about dynastic maneuvering. The women were powerful in name, but often tightly controlled by male priests. These were not independent entrepreneurs. They were figureheads, instruments of the state's divine theatre. And like all figureheads, they were replaceable. The fragility of freedom to say that women in ancient Egypt had rights is to tell only half a story. Yes, they had theoretical freedoms. But those freedoms lived in ink, not in experience. Every woman's autonomy could be undone by the men around her. A father who favored sons, a husband who squandered her dowry, a scribe who forgot to file her deed, a judge who doubted her word. She might spend her life building a home, only to be evicted from it in old age. She might earn and save, only to see her wealth claimed by a distant cousin. The illusion of ownership was cruel, because it looked like power, but it depended on permission. In ancient Egypt, beauty was not just admired, it was required. For a woman, her appearance wasn't merely a personal expression, it was a performance, a currency, a tool she was expected to perfect, maintain, and trade with care. But beneath, the soft perfume and painted eyes was a deeper truth. A woman's body was not her own. Her beauty was not hers to enjoy, it was hers to survive. The ideal woman. Crafted, not chosen. The Egyptian ideal of female beauty was etched in tomb paintings and echoed in poetry. Slender limbs, narrow waist, full lips, large eyes rimmed with dark kohl, skin smooth and golden, hair thick, perfumed and neatly braided or adorned with wigs. This was not a depiction of diversity. It was a standard, an expectation. Young girls learned early that their value could rise or fall with their appearance. A prettier girl might marry well. A less attractive one might be overlooked. Their future could be changed not by virtue, but by the symmetry of their faces. And so, they adapted. They learned to mold their bodies into palatable shapes for the gaze of others. Cosmetics, beauty or burden. Ancient Egyptian women used a wide range of cosmetics, both rich and poor. Galena for black eyeliner, malachite for green eyeshadow, red ochre for lip and cheek colour. Perfumed oils softened the skin. Henna dyed their nails. Wigs concealed thinning hair. But these rituals weren't just indulgent, they were expected. To appear without makeup, especially in public, was to seem unclean, careless, even disrespectful. The effort it took each day to meet this standard was enormous. Women spent hours grinding minerals, heating oils, plucking hair with seashell tweezers. Cosmetics became armor. Without them, a woman was exposed. Too plain, too real. And in the hottest months, when sweat melted the coal and perfume faded under the stench of labor, the illusion crumbled. Hair and wigs, crowns of expectation. Hair was another battlefield. Girls often had their heads shaved for hygiene, with a single sidelock left until puberty. Later, they were expected to grow and style their hair with care, or cover it with elaborate wigs, braided and perfumed. Wigs signaled status. The thicker, the better. But not every woman could afford one. Poorer women used plant fiber or animal hair. Wealthier women used human hair, sometimes imported. To appear with messy, unkempt hair was shameful, a sign of poverty, or worse, madness. Even in mourning, a woman was expected to present herself well. Beauty was duty, not pleasure. Clothing the body, modesty or display. Linen dresses, pleated and sheer, clung tightly to the body. For elite women, garments were often translucent, showing the figure underneath. Jewelry, elaborate collars, and beaded belts completed the look. But these garments were not chosen for comfort. They were dictated by climate, by status, by sexuality. A woman could not win. To appear too modest was to seem poor or dull. To appear too sensual was to be accused of vanity, seduction, or shame. Her clothing had to strike a perfect and impossible balance, and she always knew, no matter what she wore, someone was watching. Sexuality as commodity. A woman's sexuality was both desired and feared. Married women were expected to be fertile, responsive, and loyal. Unmarried women were expected to be untouched, pure, and quiet. Widows were expected to grieve, not flirt. But men, they had no such burden. A man could boast of conquests, take concubines, or visit prostitutes without lasting consequence. Women, meanwhile, could be ruined by a whisper. Virginity before marriage was essential. A girl accused, rightly or wrongly, of impropriety could lose everything. Her dowry, her betrothal, her family's respect. There were no tests, just gossip, suspicion, and silence. And if her body was taken by force, she bore the shame. He bore nothing. Prostitutes and dancers. Pleasure without protection. In some temple districts and taverns, women worked as dancers, musicians, or prostitutes. These women were both desired and despised, sought after in the dark and shamed in the light. They wore perfume stronger than others. Their eyes were darker, their laughs louder, their independence sharper. But they were vulnerable. Without male protection, they were at risk from abuse, poverty, and disease. Some found patrons or protectors. Others disappeared. They were the unspoken margin of society, essential, exploited, erased. Desire and danger. Even within marriage, a woman's desire was suspect. To express attraction, to initiate intimacy, was to risk judgment. A good wife pleased her husband, but did not speak too much of pleasure. She responded, but did not crave. If a woman flirted outside of marriage, she was reckless. If a man cheated, he was just a man. Desire was dangerous when it lived in a woman. It was beautiful when it lived in her appearance, her smile, her walk. But as soon as it reached her voice or her hands, it became a threat. Aging out of beauty. As a woman aged, her beauty began to fade, and so too did her visibility. Grey hair was covered with paste or dyed. Wrinkles were rubbed with oils. Breasts sagged, backs bent, skin thinned. And with every change, she slipped further from relevance. A mother might remain respected. A grandmother, even loved. But an old woman was no longer desirable, no longer valuable in the same ways. Her past beauty faded, and with it, her influence. She had once been adorned like a goddess. Now she was ignored like dust. The body never belonged to her. Her beauty was for her father's pride, her husband's pleasure, her son's comfort, and her community's scrutiny. It had to be clean, appealing, disciplined, and compliant, and it had to be effortless, at least in appearance. She could not gain weight. She could not age visibly. She could not dress too richly, nor too poorly. She could not reject attention, nor appear to seek it. Her body was not her own. It was a stage for everyone else's performance. Among all the women of ancient Egypt, none bore more silence, more invisibility, more burden than the servants and slaves. Their faces were seldom painted in tombs unless kneeling. Their names rarely carved into stone unless owned. They worked, suffered, bled, and aged without record, without ceremony, without choice. They are the women behind the women, those who stirred the bread, wove the linen, carried the burdens of the home and the temple. Their hands built Egypt just as surely as those of kings, but their stories, like their lives, were kept in shadow. Who were these women? In ancient Egypt, slavery existed, but not always in the form familiar to modern minds. Enslaved individuals came from war captures, debt bondage, punishment, or were born into it. Others worked as indentured servants, technically free, but owned by duty, debt, or desperation. Most female slaves and servants were non-Egyptian. Nubians, Libyans, Asiatics. They were viewed as outsiders, even subhuman. Their skin tone, language, and names set them apart. Even native Egyptians could become bonded by debt or misfortune, and their fate was only slightly better. What unified these women, regardless of origin, was the total lack of autonomy. They were property, not people. The household machine. Every elite household required labor. While the wife of a wealthy man might be praised for her orderliness, the truth was, she rarely lifted a broom herself. Servants, mostly women, maintained every function of the home, grinding grain, hauling water, preparing food, nursing children, cleaning floors, washing clothes, tending livestock, and managing storage. The mistress of the house issued orders. The servants obeyed, always. One command too slow, one wrong look, one broken jar, and punishment could come swiftly. A slap, a lashing, or worse, being sold, separated from children, or forced into harsher labor elsewhere. No complaint would be heard. Their suffering was expected. Temple servants and sacred bondage temples too had servants, especially women dedicated to religious service. Some were honored, like chantresses or divine adorers. But many were low-ranking workers, cleaners, kitchen staff, linen washers, incense grinders. Though they lived in sacred spaces, their lives were not sacred. They were subject to the same rules, same silences, same invisibility. Even the holiest of places had backrooms filled with toil and hardship. Behind every grand ritual stood women whose names were forgotten before the ashes cooled. Sexual exploitation, the unspoken reality. Servant women, especially those in elite households, were often victims of quiet, continuous abuse. Male masters had unchecked power. There were no formal rules to stop a master from taking advantage of a female slave. Consent was irrelevant. Resistance could be punished. Pregnancy was common. Children born from such unions were often denied full legitimacy, seen as blemishes or burdens. Wives knew. Sometimes they looked away. Sometimes they turned cruelty on the servant, blaming her instead of the man. These women bore children they hadn't asked for, loved them anyway, and sometimes watched them taken from them. Children of servants, born without names. A daughter born to a servant might grow up in the same home, sleeping on reed mats near the oven. She would learn early how to scrub, how to carry, how to serve in silence. She could be sold separately at any moment, married off as compensation, given as a gift to another household. Her future was made of other people's decisions. Even if she stayed, she could never rise, never be seen as one of them. The daughter of a servant was always a servant, no matter how kind or loyal or beautiful she was. Kindness changed nothing. Bloodlines were everything. No rights, no rest unlike citizen women. Servant women had no claim to property, no say in marriage, no legal defense if abused, no recourse if discarded. Their lives were dictated from outside. Their bodies worked to exhaustion. Their loyalty was demanded, but never returned. When sick, they worked. When pregnant, they worked. When mourning, they worked. They did not rest. They did not retire. They simply wore down until they died and were replaced. No statue, no stele, no burial worth remembering. Small acts of resistance. And yet, even in this life of hardship, some found ways to reclaim fragments of self. A servant might steal a scrap of linen to fashion a doll for her child. She might sing songs in her native tongue under her breath. She might hide an amulet beneath her dress. One charm of protection, never spoken aloud. Sometimes, women whispered stories to each other at night. Tales of far-off homelands, gods who listened, or mothers who had not always been slaves. Resistance came not in revolt, but in remembering who they were before they were owned. The quiet death, when a servant died, there were no elaborate rites. If she was lucky, she was wrapped in old linen and buried in sand near the edge of a field. Sometimes her master paid for a basic ceremony. Sometimes not. If she had children, they might cry. But they too were bound. They could not weep too loudly. The work still had to be done. The sun rose the next day. A new girl might arrive. The floor would still be swept. The bread still baked. The woman was gone, and the world did not notice. In ancient Egypt, a woman's honor was not carried in her actions, her intelligence, or her soul. It was measured in silence, in obedience, and most of all, in chastity. This obsession with female purity shaped lives, dictated fates, and buried countless women in shame that was never theirs to carry. And the tragedy, a woman's purity could be questioned, stolen, broken, without her consent or her fault. Virginity, the price of respect. From the moment a girl reached puberty, her body became a question mark. Was she still pure? Had anyone touched her? Had she looked too long at the wrong man? Had she smiled too freely? There was no test, no proof, only suspicions. If she was believed to be a virgin on her wedding night, her family held their heads high. If not, even by false rumor, her name could be ruined. Dowries could be cancelled, engagements called off. Her value, as judged by others, evaporated like dew in the heat. Virginity wasn't just personal. It was a family's pride, a village's judgment, a currency too fragile to carry, yet demanded without fail. Guilt by association. A girl didn't need to do anything wrong to be labeled impure. Walking alone? Suspicious? Speaking to a man not of her household? Inappropriate? Being beautiful? Dangerous? Even being raped could be twisted into temptation. A girl who was assaulted might find herself blamed. Why was she there? Why didn't she scream? Did she enjoy the attention? The questions were endless and cruel. There was no police protection, no true legal defense. If she became pregnant, her shame was made visible. She might be forced into a quiet marriage to the very man who hurt her, or sent away to hide. Meanwhile, her attacker walked on, untouched by disgrace. The family's burden. In ancient Egypt, a woman's reputation wasn't hers alone. It belonged to her entire family. A daughter's shame could impact her brother's ability to marry well. A sister's reputation could damage her father's standing in the village. A woman's mistake might be spoken of long after her death. Fathers became watchmen. Mothers became enforcers. Brothers became guards. Girls were taught not to trust, not to question, not to risk anything. And if something happened, anything that might bring dishonor, the family's first instinct was to hide it, cover it, silence it, not for her sake, but for theirs. The punishment of rumor reputation was fragile, and the punishment for its loss was often silent exile. A girl accused of impurity might not be beaten or imprisoned, but she might be excluded from weddings. She might be denied at the well. Her name whispered with pity or scorn. No one would say it outright, but she would feel it in every turned shoulder and cold glance. If she was lucky, she would be married, off quickly to someone desperate. If not, she might remain unmarried forever, dependent on relatives, treated as an embarrassment. Her shame was permanent, even if it had no cause. Men's freedom, women's chains. The double standard was absolute. Man could visit a prostitute and still be considered honorable. He could father illegitimate children without consequence. He could speak freely about his desires, even brag. But a woman? One wrong step, even imagined, and she could lose everything. She could not admit desire. She could not make choices. She could not say yes or no without risking judgment. Her purity was not her choice. It was everyone else's to decide, everyone else's to weigh, and everyone else's to discuss. She merely lived beneath it, like a bird beneath a falling sky. Religious. Reinforcement temples reinforced these ideals. Goddesses were praised for loyalty, chastity, and maternal care. Even the powerful Isis was revered for remaining faithful to her dead husband, Osiris, and raising Horus alone. There was no goddess of rebellion, no myth of a woman who chose passion and was rewarded. The message was clear. Good women suffered, silently, served loyally, and gave birth nobly. Bad women. They brought chaos. They invited plague. They were temptresses, witches, or worse. These stories shaped generations of belief that controlled women more effectively than swords. The consequences of pregnancy for married women. Pregnancy was expected and celebrated. But for unmarried women, it was a curse. No woman in ancient Egypt could hide a pregnancy for long. Her belly told the truth, even if she never spoke a word. And when that truth appeared, it was her name that was scorched, her body that bore the cost. Some were disowned, others forced into marriages. A few fled to temples, hoping for mercy or seclusion. A single night, chosen or not, could define a lifetime. And the child? They too would be marked, internalized. Shame over time, many women accepted the shame as theirs. They blamed themselves for the looks they received, for the men who touched without permission, for the silence that followed. Mothers passed the fear to daughters. Daughters learned to carry it without question. Even in old age, some women looked back and wondered, did I do something wrong? The shame clung, even when they had done nothing but exist. The weight of honor. And so, Generation after generation, women were taught to guard something invisible, to protect an idea so fragile it could be broken by a glance, a word, a man's lie. They bore this burden in every step, every word, every gesture. They smiled when they didn't want to. They stayed silent when they were hurt. They apologized for things they never did. And still, many were judged, forgotten, shamed. Because, in ancient Egypt, a woman's greatest sin wasn't betrayal or violence. It was being seen in the wrong light, by the wrong man, at the wrong time. In ancient Egypt, the death of a husband was not just a personal loss. It was a structural collapse. A woman might be left with land, children, or goods, but she was also left vulnerable in a society built on male guardianship. A widow's tears dried quickly, because after mourning came the fight for survival, the rituals of grief. When a husband died, his wife was expected to mourn loudly. She tore her clothes, scattered dust in her hair, cried until hoarse. Her grief was a performance, as much as it was a release. Professional mourners might join her, wailing and beating their chests in rhythmic sorrow. But once the burial was complete, once the tomb was sealed and the priests gone, she was alone, and everything that had been hers in name, home, land, children, now existed under a question mark. Legal status, the widow's in-between world legally. A widow had some rights. If her husband left a will, she might inherit his house, tools, animals, or property. She might even continue running the household, especially if she had sons. But these rights were fragile. They depended on documentation, cooperation from male relatives, and her own ability to navigate complex male-dominated systems. If no will existed, or if her claims were challenged, she could be evicted by her husband's brothers. Her in-laws might argue that she owed them loyalty, or that she had no right to stay without producing sons. One papyrus did not guarantee safety, it only gave her a reason to argue. A widow with sons. If a widow had sons, especially older ones, her position was stronger. She could remain in the home as the household matron, managing the property until her son came of age. He, in turn, might protect her interests, ensuring she wasn't displaced or exploited. But as boys grew into men, they gained power. And sometimes, the very sons she had raised became the ones who silenced her voice, who corrected her decisions, who made it clear the home was now theirs. Motherhood once gave her authority. Widowhood made her dependent on that very authority being respected. And if her sons died before her, her world collapsed again. A widow with daughters. If a widow had only daughters, her position was far more precarious. Daughters couldn't legally protect her. They couldn't inherit the household unless explicitly named, and they had no power to prevent uncles or male cousins from claiming rights over their father's estate. In such cases, widows were often pressured to remarry or sent to live with relatives, sometimes even married to a brother-in-law, not for love, but to keep property in the family. A woman might go from matron of her home to guest in another's overnight. Forced remarriage and economic desperation. Widows were frequently remarried, not out of affection, but necessity. A man might take her to gain land or consolidate wealth. A widow, especially one without sons, had little leverage to say no. Her consent was often assumed, especially if she had no family backing her. Even a younger widow, beautiful and healthy, was not envied. She was viewed as available, whether she wished to be or not. Offers came quickly, refusals were frowned upon, and if she rejected all suitors, she might be left to starve. Temples and religious refuge. Some widows turned to temples for refuge. Religious institutions occasionally offered positions as weavers, cooks, or caretakers. In rare cases, noble widows became chantresses or held ceremonial roles. But for most, this was no salvation. Temple positions were limited and often reserved for women with connections, education, or wealth. Ordinary widows, poor and forgotten, rarely found a place among the gods. They lit incense from outside the temple walls, praying for relief no priest would provide. Widowhood as social stigma. The mourning period was temporary, but suspicion often lingered. Widows were seen as both vulnerable and potentially dangerous. Rumors of seduction, witchcraft, or emotional instability were not uncommon. A beautiful widow was eyed with both desire and distrust. She was watched when she spoke to men, judged if she smiled too soon, expected to grieve forever, but also to stay out of the way. No longer protected by a husband, she was suddenly expected to protect herself against everything. Loneliness. Behind the walls, many widows lived alone, especially elderly ones. Their children married off. Their peers passed away. Their days grew long and silent. They still woke early, tended fires, baked bread, but they spoke less, laughed less, saw fewer faces. They remembered a time when their home was full, when their opinions mattered. Now they existed in the gaps between others' lives. Some were pitied, some forgotten, and some faded quietly. Their names mentioned less and less until they were not spoken at all. A quiet end. If a widow died with wealth, she might be buried near her husband, perhaps in a small tomb, her name etched beside his. But most widows, especially poor ones, received simple burials. No grand procession, no priests, no elaborate texts. Her body was wrapped in linen, her belongings scattered, her home passed on. The woman who had once kept a family alive, who had fought to hold her place, vanished with barely a sound. In ancient Egypt, fertility was not merely a blessing, it was identity. To be a woman was to bear life. To fail at that most sacred of expectations was to risk becoming invisible, irrelevant, even cursed. In a world that worshipped the womb, barren women stood outside the circle. They were pitied, sometimes scorned, often feared, and always watched. The goddesses of birth, and their absence, Isis, Hathor, Taweret, goddesses whose domains included childbirth, motherhood, and protection of women in labor. These deities were central to Egyptian worship. Shrines and temples honored them. Women offered incense, milk, pomegranates, and prayers. And those who could not conceive, they prayed harder. They fasted, chanted, whispered sacred hymns by moonlight. They placed amulets beneath their beds, bathed in ritual waters, consumed herbal concoctions brewed by midwives and priestesses. Still, some wombs remained silent, and with every passing year, the silence grew heavier. The burden of blame. Unlike modern understandings of infertility, ancient Egyptians overwhelmingly blamed the woman. A man could father no children with multiple wives or concubines, and yet suspicion rarely fell on him. His virility was assumed. It was the woman who was faulty, the one who refused to conceive, who had closed her womb, or who had perhaps offended a god. There were no scientific diagnoses, only superstitions. Some claimed a barren woman had been cursed in a past life. Others believed she was possessed. A few whispered that she had sinned in secret, and her punishment was childlessness. Whatever the theory, the result was the same: shame. Inside the home, isolation and suspicion. A barren woman within a marriage was often treated like a cracked jar, kept around but no longer cherished. Her mother-in-law might complain that the family line would end. Her husband might grow distant, impatient, or cruel. Her neighbours would stop asking her when the baby was due. They already knew. It wasn't. If her husband had the means, he might take a second wife, sometimes openly, sometimes with a lie. A servant girl, a gift, someone younger, someone fertile, and the first wife. She remained in the home, watching another woman bear the children she had once dreamed of. Social exclusion. Unspoken exile festivals. Honouring Hathor or celebrating the births of deities were joyous for mothers, but painful for those left childless. Woman without children was rarely invited to lead rituals. She was excluded from songs about motherhood, from roles in ceremonies tied to family fertility. Even other women treated her with quiet discomfort, unsure whether to comfort her, avoid her, or simply pretend she did not notice their children running past her ankles. Some stopped going to gatherings entirely, better to avoid the sideways glances, the endless questions. Still nothing. Or, have you tried praying at Dendera? A barren woman became a ghost among the living. Medical remedies, desperation, and danger, ancient Egyptian medical papyri, contain numerous cures for infertility. Some were gentle, herbal tonics, poultices, fertility baths. Others were terrifying, insertions of crushed dates and crocodile dung, or ritual bleeding. Midwives, herbalists, and temple healers all claimed to know the way to open the womb. The barren woman tried them all. She swallowed bitter roots, burned incense until she choked, whispered charms in the dark. She allowed strangers to touch her, probe her, scold her. She promised gods things she could not give, and still, nothing. The pain became not just physical, but existential. Who was she, if not a mother? Jealousy and despair. She watched her sisters' bellies swell, watched neighbors sing lullabies, watched children grow into men, and in quiet corners of her home, she wept. Not because she wished ill on others, but because the ache inside her never stopped. Sometimes she dreamed of a child calling her mother, woke up reaching for someone who was never there. In her garden, she planted fig trees and spoke to them softly, not because she believed they could hear, but because they were the only thing she could raise. Marital breakdown and rejection. Infertility could destroy marriages. Some husbands abandoned barren wives outright. Others kept them under the same roof, but made no secret of their disappointment. A once loving partner might become cold, distant, silent. In rare cases, a woman initiated separation herself, especially if she was of noble birth and had property of her own. But more often, she stayed, she endured. Better to remain unloved than to be homeless. Better to bear silence than to bear hunger. Adoption, a complicated consolation. There is limited evidence that adoption occurred in ancient Egypt, but it was not common. A woman might raise a relative's child or care for an orphaned niece. But this did not restore her standing. She was still childless in the eyes of the community. The child was never truly hers. No amount of love changed that. Even in motherhood by proxy, the barren woman was reminded daily, this was not your child. This was a borrowed identity. Growing old without heirs, in old age, barren women suffered doubly. They had no children to care for them, no sons to manage their burial, no daughters to weep beside them. They became dependent on nieces, nephews, or the goodwill of distant relatives. And if those ties failed, they died alone. Even their funerals were quieter. Less incense, fewer mourners. Their names carved into smaller stones, if at all. They were women who had given love, prayers, effort, and been given silence in return. In ancient Egypt, religion permeated every corner of life. The gods were everywhere, in the wind, the river, the home, and the tomb. And women were no strangers to devotion. They were not just believers, they were spiritual laborers, bound by ritual, habit, and inherited fear. But their place in religion was complex. They were allowed to worship, to offer, to plead, but rarely to lead. Their spiritual world was vast, but their spiritual authority was carefully limited. Women's private religion, home altars and household gods. While public temples were dominated by male priests, the household was a woman's sacred space. In corners of kitchens or near the threshold, small altars were raised. Figurines of Isis, Taweret, Bez, or Hathor stood among offerings of bread, beer, milk, or flowers. These gods were personal, guardians of childbirth, love, health, and safety. Women whispered their prayers while grinding grain. They touched amulets before dressing their children. They hung charms above the door, buried tokens beneath beds, painted eyes on jars to ward off evil. This was not organized religion. It was spiritual maintenance. a daily stitching of protection into the fabric of life. The labor of ritual religion, for many women, was work. They were responsible for cleansing, the home before holidays, preparing food for feasts, lighting lamps during sacred nights, and reciting chants passed from mother to daughter. These rituals were unpaid, unrecognized, and essential. Some rituals were public, such as carrying offerings to the local temple during festivals. But most were quiet, unrecorded acts. Washing a child while reciting prayers, burying a miscarried fetus with a whispered chant, pouring milk into the earth after a nightmare. Each act cost time, effort, and belief. And though the gods did not always answer, the labor continued, because not performing these rituals meant tempting misfortune. Amulets, charms, and the fear of the unseen. The spiritual world of women in ancient Egypt was filled with invisible dangers. Evil spirits, curses, and malevolent gods were blamed for illness, infertility, nightmares, and accidents. To combat them, women surrounded themselves with protective objects, amulets in the shape of scarabs, cats, frogs, ankhs, and eyes, papyrus scrolls tucked into clothing, wands carved from hippopotamus ivory to ward off demons during childbirth. Each item carried meaning and weight. Women often made or inherited their own talismans. Poor women might craft them from mud or straw. Richer women commissioned them from temple artisans. But belief was not about wealth. Even the poorest woman clutched her charm as tightly as a queen might hold her gold. Temples. Allowed, but not empowered. Women were permitted inside temples. They prayed, gave offerings, and celebrated festivals. Some even served as chantresses, temple dancers, or sacred musicians, particularly in large cities like Thebes or Memphis. These roles brought some status. A chantress might walk beside a priest during a procession. A temple cook might receive a ration of bread and beer. A scribe's wife might tend sacred gardens. But priesthood, true spiritual power, that belonged almost entirely to men. Only in rare cases, most famously the god's wife of Amun, did a woman rise to religious prominence. But even then, she was carefully managed. Her power was symbolic, her rituals scripted. She could carry the sistrum and chant hymns. But she could not write new doctrine. She could kneel before the gods, but never stand in their image. The burden of superstition. Belief brought comfort, but also terror. If a child died, it might be the mother's fault for skipping a ritual. If a husband fell ill, perhaps she had angered a deity. If she bled too long, if she dreamed of snakes, if her bread rose too quickly, each sign might carry hidden meaning. And so, she chased signs, consulted fortune tellers, paid scribes to interpret omens, dug in the dirt for lost talismans, burned garlic at dawn, stayed indoors during eclipses. She was the guardian of her family's spiritual safety. And if something went wrong, it was she who bore the blame. Dreams and divination. Dreams were believed to be messages from the divine. Women recorded them, or, more often, repeated them to temple interpreters. Did she dream of water? That might mean birth. Of a snake. A warning. Of a broken jar. Impending loss. Dream books, often owned by male scribes, offered interpretations, but women carried the burden of application. She adjusted her daily life based on a dream, postponed a trip, hid her child, refused intimacy. The gods spoke in riddles, and women listened with open fear. Religious festivals, joy and exclusion festivals like the beautiful Feast of the Valley, honoring Hathor and the ancestors, offered women rare chances to celebrate. They wore bright dresses, sang songs, drank beer, danced with neighbors. Laughter returned to tired faces. But even here, there were boundaries. Only certain women could participate in temple rituals. Poor women stayed outside the gates. Some served the feasts, others merely watched. Joy was permitted, but never total freedom. Faith. Without authority, perhaps the most tragic truth of women's religion in ancient Egypt was this: they believed deeply, gave endlessly, worked tirelessly, and yet their voices were never written into the sacred texts. They were present in the worship, but absent in the doctrine. Their hands shaped the altars, but their names were never etched into the scrolls. The gods they served remained silent. The priests they obeyed never looked them in the eye. Their faith was deep, but their power was shallow. In ancient Egypt, menstruation marked the official beginning of womanhood, but not in celebration. There were no feasts, no warm embraces, no rites of maturity. Instead, the onset of a girl's period marked the beginning of restriction, suspicion, and silence. To bleed was natural, but it was not neutral. It was shameful. It was hidden. And for many women, it was a source of isolation that would last most of their lives. The first time, a private storm. The arrival of a girl's first period often came with fear and confusion. Education on the matter was minimal and private, passed from mother to daughter, usually in hushed tones. A girl might wake to blood on her linen and think she was dying. If her mother was near and kind, she explained. If not, the girl cried alone. From that moment forward, her body was no longer just hers. It was watched, managed, measured. She was now a woman, which meant she was now fertile and, by society's rules, now marketable for marriage. Her innocence had not been lost, but it was no longer recognized. Blood and purity. A paradox ironically, while menstruation signified fertility, the very trait most prized in Egyptian women, it also made a woman impure. During her bleeding days, a woman was often expected to avoid religious activities. Some families kept her from preparing food, handling sacred objects, or entering temples. In wealthier homes, she might be asked to sleep separately. This impurity was not about hygiene, it was spiritual. The blood of life was treated like a pollutant. And so, women learned to hide it, wrap it, clean it, disappear with it. Managing the flow, cloth, and secrecy, there were no tampons, no modern pads. Egyptian women used folded linen rags, often washed and reused. These were tucked carefully into the folds of their clothing or tied with linen belts. Some used papyrus padding or dried plant fiber, though these could be painful. Poorer women might use nothing at all, squatting for hours or staying close to home during heavy days. There were no disposal bins. Used cloth was washed by hand, discreetly, often under the cover of darkness. Stains were scrubbed out with sand or natron, the same cleansing agent used in embalming the dead. Men were never meant to see it, or know, or ask. Pain and silence, menstrual cramps, headaches, weakness. These were never acknowledged publicly. There was no medical care for menstrual discomfort, no relief. A woman might press warm stones to her belly, drink herbal tea, chew bitter roots. Some whispered to goddesses, Taweret, Hathor, for gentleness, but mostly she endured in silence. Pain was normalized, dismissed, expected. A woman who complained too much was dramatic. A woman who faltered in her duties was lazy. The blood had to flow. The bread still had to bake. Menstruation and magic. Fear of the unseen. Ancient Egyptians were deeply superstitious, and menstrual blood, like most bodily fluids, was believed to hold spiritual power. Some thought it could attract demons if mishandled. Others believed it could be used in magic, for healing or harm. Writings from medical papyri suggest menstruation was considered a type of bodily poison that needed to be expelled. A bad humor, a cleansing, but also a threat. Witches were rumored to use menstrual blood in love spells or curses. Even midwives, when desperate, turned to such taboos. And so, menstruating women were watched, not just with discomfort, but with suspicion. Bleeding, and the marriage bed virgin brides were expected to bleed on their wedding night. This blood, ironically, was prized. It proved purity. It confirmed value. But the monthly blood that followed, that was unwelcome. Husbands avoided their wives during menstruation, not out of empathy, but disgust. Some forbade even eye contact during those days. Others ignored it entirely, expecting women to perform duties regardless of pain or flow. And if a woman bled irregularly, missed a period, she might be questioned, suspected, feared, because missing blood could mean pregnancy, or disease, or worse, divine punishment. The bleeding of loss. Not all bleeding was monthly. Miscarriages were common, and the blood that followed was a different kind of horror. Women bled alone in side rooms, curled on mats. There were no gynecologists, no painkillers, no antiseptics. Some survived, others did not. And those who did, who returned to the rhythm of life, carried the scars silently. There were no words for the mourning of a child never born. Just more blood, just more washing. The cycle of shame. Every month, for decades, a woman endured the cycle. Bleed, clean, hide, heal, repeat. She marked time not by the calendar, but by the ache in her womb, by the rhythm of retreat and return. She might still pray, still laugh, still raise children and cook for 10, but always the blood remained unspoken. Even old women past their cycles spoke of it only in metaphor. They called it the shadow, the monthly guest, the curse, as though it had never been part of them, but something that visited and shamed and left. After the bleeding stops, menopause brought relief, but also loss. A woman who stopped bleeding could no longer bear children. She was no longer fertile, and though she might be respected as an elder, her social value shifted. She was done, complete perhaps, but also used. She had bled her worth into the earth and been emptied. In the bustling heart of ancient Egyptian society, beyond the pyramids and priests, behind the statues and scrolls, were women who worked, not as nobles or queens, not as wives alone, but as labourers. Their hands wove linen for kings, brewed beer for rituals, baked bread for gods, and built the very fabric of daily life. And yet, their labour was mostly invisible. The fabric of society, spun by women weaving, was perhaps the most common skilled task performed by Egyptian women. Flax was grown along the banks of the Nile, harvested and stripped by men, then handed to women to spin and weave. Weaving was not a hobby, it was an industry. Women sat for hours, sometimes in courtyards, other times on rooftops or inside workshops, threading looms, counting strands, adjusting tension with rough fingers. The linen they made clothed the living and the dead. It was traded, gifted, and taxed. Fine linen meant status. Royalty demanded it. Temples stockpiled it. And who made it? Women. Often unnamed, unpaid, and uncelebrated. The weaver's whirled a weaver's tools were simple: spindles, combs, looms. Her posture, bent, still, focused. Her hours, long, elite households might employ dozens of weavers. Poor women wove at home to barter cloth for grain. Some temples hired entire teams of women to produce robes for statues and offerings. Weaving was passed from mother to daughter. No formal schooling. A woman might begin learning at 8, and by 12, her cloth would be sold in market stalls she'd never see. It wasn't glamorous. It was survival. Her body ached. Her eyesight strained. Her reward, a quiet pile of fabric, folded and carried away. Brewing beer, a woman's domain. In modern times, beer is a man's drink. In ancient Egypt, beer was a woman's craft. Every household brewed beer. It was daily nourishment, religious offering, and social glue. Made from fermented barley loaves soaked in water and flavoured with dates or herbs, beer provided calories and hydration. It was safer than raw Nile water, and tastier too. Women were the brewers. They baked the mash, crushed the grains, stirred the bubbling liquid in clay vessels. In larger estates and temples, women oversaw brewery teams. During festivals, Beer flowed like water. Hathor, the goddess of love and intoxication, was honored with ritual drinking. Women danced and poured. Their hands turned grain into celebration. But again, their labor vanished after the cup was drained. The bakery behind every meal bread was the staple of the Egyptian diet, and women were its makers. They harvested grain, ground it by hand with stone grinders, which wore down their joints and filled their lungs with dust, kneaded the dough, shaped the loaves, and baked them in clay ovens. Poor families made coarse bread with sand still in the grain. Wealthier women shaped dough into animal figures or braided offerings for gods. There were no bakeries on every corner. The home was the bakery. And in temples, women again, baking for priests, baking for funerals, baking for gods who never said, "Thank you." Women in marketplaces. Though the larger trading class was dominated by men, women were a common sight in local marketplaces. They sold flax, fish, onions, pottery, linen scraps, cosmetics, and perfumes. Some sold beer from jugs, others offered incense wrapped in reed leaves. A few offered healing herbs or charms. Most were widows, unmarried women, or wives supplementing a husband's income. Their stalls were small, often a mat on the ground. Their profits, modest. They bartered, they haggled. They endured stares, insults, heat, dust, and fatigue. For every gold seller gilding Pharaoh's tomb, 100 women were scraping to afford a jar of oil. Work and motherhood. No separation. Women's labor never replaced motherhood. It was stacked on top. She might weave all day and nurse a baby at her hip. She might rise at midnight to check the beer fermenting in jars, then hush a crying child. She might bake bread, barter for onions, return home, and still be expected to offer a smile and serve dinner. There was no maternity leave, no rest, no childcare, only adaptation. Children learned early to stay out of the way or help. A toddler handed reeds to her mother. A girl stirred mash with a stick. A boy carried the bread to the oven. There was no idle time, only the rhythm of tasks, all stitched together with exhaustion. Working for temples, sacred but harsh temples were the largest employers in Egypt, and many women worked within their walls, not as priestesses, but as servants and craftswomen. They wove temple garments, brewed beer for ceremonies, prepared sacred meals, cleaned altars, polished floors. During festivals they danced, sang, clapped sistrums. These were not acts of joy, they were labor. A woman might spend 12 hours kneeling, scrubbing floors beside sacred pools. She might sing until her throat cracked, then return to scrub again. The gods were said to demand perfection, and women were expected to deliver it. Their names were not recorded on temple walls, their sweat only briefly noticed. No retirement, no reward. There was no age when a woman stopped working, unless she was wealthy, and most were not. She worked until she physically couldn't. Old women with curved spines still wove, still swept, still mended. Their hands shook, their eyes dimmed, but no one said, "Rest." They had no pensions, no servants of their own. If they were lucky, a daughter took over. If not, they labored to death. And when they died, their tools were passed on. Their stories rarely were. In ancient Egypt, motherhood was deeply sacred, but in royal and noble households, it was also profoundly political. The womb wasn't merely a private vessel, it was a public function, a tool to maintain dynasties, secure power, and appease gods. And for women at court, especially those of lower rank, this meant their bodies could be claimed, not for passion, but for legacy. The obsession with bloodlines. Egyptian kings were not just rulers, they were gods in human form. Their blood was believed to carry divine essence. The continuation of that line, through sons, was paramount. Dynastic succession was a national concern. If a pharaoh died without a male heir, chaos could erupt. Civil war, foreign invasion, religious confusion. And so, securing heirs was not optional. It was state policy. Royal wives who failed to produce sons were not discarded, but they were often overshadowed. New wives were brought in, concubines, servants, even sisters and daughters, in extreme cases, if the lineage needed preservation. In the palace, a woman's worth was measured in umbilical cords. The king's harem, a palace within a palace behind, the ornate pillars of the royal court, was another world, the royal harem. This was not a den of pleasure, as later cultures imagined. It was a bureaucratic institution, a carefully managed collection of wives, concubines, and their children. Many women were foreign princesses, gifts from treaties, or daughters of Egyptian nobles offered in exchange for favor. Each woman had a rank. The great royal wife stood at the top. Below her, secondary wives, royal daughters, lesser consorts, and court servants. Many never spoke to the king, but all were expected to be ready, ready to smile, ready to serve, ready to conceive. The practice of political surrogacy, though not formally recorded as surrogacy in the modern sense, ancient Egypt practiced forms of it, especially among the elite. If a queen could not bear a child, a lower-ranking woman might be chosen to conceive on her behalf. This child, once born, might be claimed and raised as the queen's own. Publicly, the child was royal. Privately, the birth mother might vanish. This arrangement benefited the queen, secured the lineage, and preserved palace dignity. But for the surrogate, there was no legacy. She had done her duty. She was rarely remembered. Her child might sit on a throne she could never approach. Foreign women as breeders, Egypt's diplomatic marriages were often transactional. A foreign king might send his daughter to marry the pharaoh. In return, Egypt offered grain, gold, or peace. These women had no agency in the decision. They became royal wombs on foreign soil, expected to assimilate, to bear children, and to remain politically silent. Some adapted, some vanished. A few, like the Mitanni princess Kiluhepa, later called Gilukhepa, appear briefly in historical records, long enough to confirm their arrival, never long enough to tell their stories. They carried future rulers within them, but were never seen as rulers themselves. Motherhood. Without mothering, in royal courts, mothers did not always raise their children. Nurses, wet nurses and tutors took over. Royal sons were trained for war and governance. Daughters were prepared for marriage or temple roles. The mother's task was conception, not guidance. Even queens had limited access to their offspring. A child's time belonged to the palace, to tutors, to scribes, and ultimately, to the gods. Some women grieved this distance. Others accepted it as duty, but none could change it. To bear a son was a victory. To know him, a privilege, not a guarantee. Rivalry and reproduction. The pressure to produce sons bred rivalry. Harem politics were volatile. A new wife who gave birth to a healthy boy might rise in status overnight, becoming a threat to the existing queen. A childless queen might scheme to block another's child from recognition. Mothers formed secret alliances. Whispers shaped destinies. Poisonings, banishments, false accusations. They were not myths, but weapons of womb-bound warfare. Every woman in the palace was both sacred vessel and potential traitor. Religious justification. The political manipulation of motherhood was sanctified through religion. Isis, the divine mother, raised Horus to avenge his father Osiris. Hathor nurtured the sun god through each night. These myths provided a blueprint for political motherhood: protective, sacrificial, silent. Queens were often depicted with children at their breast, eyes raised in prayer, bodies still in service. Even fertility statues, nude women with wide hips and nursing infants, reflected an ideal, a woman whose body existed entirely for continuation. Motherhood was not just natural, it was holy and thus unchallengeable. Those who couldn't bear children, even in royal life, Not all women conceived. Some were quietly moved to the fringes of the court. Others joined temple orders. A few, if still politically useful, retained ceremonial titles but lived in shadow. They were honored but no longer consulted, dressed in gold but not touched, present in ceremonies but absent from succession. Their wombs had failed, and in doing so, they became ornaments, silent, still, forgotten, legacy. Without name, many royal children rose to power. Some became pharaohs, a few launched new dynasties, but most of their mothers remain unnamed in history. Only a few women, like Tiye, mother of Akhenaten, or Amosa Nefertari, queen and priestess, had their names carved into stone beside their sons. Most others disappeared, replaced by the titles wife, concubine, mother of the king. Even in eternity, their identities were borrowed. Their blood lived on, but their names did not. In ancient Egypt, the law was not blind. It looked at women through lenses of suspicion, tradition, and control. While the civilization built systems of justice and order, those systems were never built for women, at least not equally. Women could be victims, criminals, or witnesses, but rarely were they treated as people with agency. The law saw them as daughters, wives, vessels of shame or honor. Their guilt often was presumed. Their defense often was silence. And their punishment, it came swiftly, visibly, on the body. The legal illusion of equality Egyptian women had, on paper, remarkable legal rights for the ancient world. They could own property, inherit wealth, appear in court, and file complaints. These rights were theoretically equal to those of men, but theory bends beneath pressure. In practice, women were discouraged from confronting men in legal disputes. Their testimonies, especially if they contradicted male relatives or officials, were often viewed as emotional or unreliable. And unless a woman had powerful male backing, brothers, fathers, scribes, her words floated unmoored in the bureaucratic Nile. Justice was not free, it was navigated, and few women had the means to sail. Crimes of women, real and imagined. Women were accused of theft, adultery, witchcraft, abortion, and gossip. Some charges were real, others invented, exaggerated, or weaponized. A woman caught stealing grain might face fines, flogging, or enslavement. A woman accused of seducing a married man could be mutilated, shaved, or shunned. A woman believed to have practiced dark magic might be whipped publicly, her possessions burned. But often, the crime was not the act, but her independence. Speaking too freely, refusing a marriage, being seen with a man at night, giving birth out of wedlock. All of these could be twisted into evidence, and once accused, few women had the tools or the time to prove innocence. Adultery, the most dangerous crime, no. Offense drew more brutal consequences for women than adultery. Though both men and women were technically bound to marital fidelity, enforcement was far from equal. A man's infidelity was a private matter. A woman's was a public disgrace. If found guilty, sometimes even without proof, a woman could be divorced instantly, lose her dowry, be disowned by her family, and suffer public shaming. In rare cases, she might be executed. Punishment varied by social class. A noblewoman might be exiled. A servant girl might be beaten until unconscious. A concubine might be cast out or quietly killed. And if the pregnancy revealed the truth, her fate was sealed before the child ever cried. Victim or criminal, rape existed, assault existed, abuse existed, but the legal system rarely recognized them on behalf of women. Unless there was a male witness, a confession, or bruises so severe they were undeniable, the burden of proof fell on the victim. And even then, she might be blamed for tempting the man, for walking alone, for wearing perfume, for smiling. A raped woman could lose her marriage, her family's support, and any hope of remarriage. In some cases, victims were pressured to marry their rapist to restore honor. In this twisted logic, the crime was not the violation, it was the exposure. Public punishment, pain, and message. The most common punishments for women were physical and humiliating. Beatings, often administered in public, were meant to correct and to warn. A woman might be lashed in the marketplace while onlookers jeered. Her back bore the scars of not just pain, but memory. Some were shaved, hair removed to mark disgrace. Others were branded, their crimes burned into their skin. A few had noses or ears cut off, especially in adultery cases. Each wound carried a message. This is what happens when a woman forgets her place, and the community remembered. Imprisonment and slavery. There were prisons in ancient Egypt, but they were rarely used for long-term sentences. Instead, punishment came swiftly. However, some women were detained temporarily, often in temple precincts or state buildings, before judgment was passed. If the crime was severe or the woman lacked protection, she might be sentenced to forced labor, grain mills, breweries, quarry fields, essentially slavery. Some never returned. Their names faded from scrolls, their faces from memory, their bodies from life. Justice for women, the exception, not the rule. Occasionally, a woman won her case. A widow who proved her in-laws had stolen her inheritance. A merchant's wife who defended her right to property. A mother who sued a man for harming her daughter. These victories were recorded in scribal archives. Small, rare lights in a dark landscape. But each one required power, money, or luck. The average woman could not afford scribes, could not travel to the capital, could not wait months for a verdict, and so most endured, most yielded, most remained quiet. Justice was for the bold, and few were bold without consequence. The judgment. After death, Egyptians believed that in the afterlife, one's soul would be judged by Osiris. The heart weighed against the feather of Maat. Truth, justice, balance. For women who suffered injustice in life, this promised a kind of spiritual hope, that the gods might see what men did not, that a woman's pain, her silence, her truth, would finally be recognized. But belief could not heal bruises, or undo exile, or bring back children taken. The afterlife was a balm, the real world remained cruel. Ancient Egypt's goddesses were powerful. They gave birth to the cosmos, resurrected kings, healed the sick, and guarded the dead. Women worshipped them with reverence, painted them into tombs, carried their images in processions. But the reverence for divine femininity was not extended to mortal women. The sacred feminine, so exalted in myth, became a model for obedience, sacrifice, and silence. The goddess was a symbol, the woman was an expectation, and from that expectation grew centuries of exploitation. Isis, the mother who never left, perhaps the most beloved figure in the Egyptian pantheon. Isis was not only a mother goddess, she was the mother. She resurrected her slain husband Osiris. She protected her son Horus from assassins and storms. She taught magic to gods and mortals alike. Isis was the template for ideal womanhood, loyal, nurturing, patient, and powerful, but never for herself. Her power existed solely in service to others. And so, Egyptian women were taught, be like Isis, devote yourself to your husband, even in death. Raise your sons to avenge their fathers. Endure betrayal. Endure loss. Endure everything, not because it made you free, but because it made you good. Hathor, the mask of joy. Hathor was the goddess of love, music, motherhood, and joy. She danced in golden temples, poured wine for the gods, laughed at the edge of the heavens. But she also had a darker side. When enraged, she became Sekhmet, the lioness who drank blood and destroyed cities. This duality was instructive. Women were told to be like Hathor, pleasing, charming, fertile, but warned not to become like Sekhmet, angry, wild, uncontrollable. To be joyful was divine. To be angry was dangerous. And so, women learned to smile even through pain. Laughter became a survival tactic. They were told, your beauty is a gift to others. Use it wisely, quietly. Taweret, Bastet, and the midwives of the divine other goddesses served more practical roles. Taweret, the hippo-shaped protector, guarded women in childbirth. Her statues stood by birthing bricks. Her image was carved into amulets and painted onto walls. Bastet, the cat goddess, shielded homes and children. She was invoked in times of illness or unrest. Her festivals, wild and ecstatic, offered rare release for women who spent most of their lives serving others. These goddesses were beloved, accessible, relatable, but also limiting. They reinforced the idea that a woman's highest purpose was to give life, protect life, nurture life, not to live life. Even the gods agreed. Divine archetypes and earthly expectations, the traits of these goddesses, loyalty, fertility, protection, endurance, became not just ideals, but mandates. A good woman was patient, like Isis, loving like Hathor, maternal like Taweret, graceful like Bastet. A woman who strayed from these models risked judgment. There was no goddess of ambition, no patron of female rebellion, no divine example for women who refused marriage, questioned motherhood, or lived for themselves. Every myth was a mirror, and women were asked to smile into it, even if it did not reflect their truth. Sacred imagery, real control temples used goddess imagery to decorate their walls, cloak their rituals, and justify their hierarchies. Priests dressed idols of Hathor in gold and silk, but refused to let real women lead ceremonies. Isis was shown nursing her son with tenderness, while real mothers were banned from temple grounds during menstruation. The divine feminine was everywhere, except in positions of power. It was beauty without voice, strength without freedom, worship without equality, and women knew it. They bowed to stone faces that looked like them, but never spoke back. The political use of the goddess even pharaohs invoked the divine feminine to justify control. A ruler might call his queen the living Isis, praising her obedience. A scribe might inscribe poems comparing noblewomen to Hathor. Graceful, beautiful, silent. Royal women used these titles too, but they came with conditions. To be Isis meant sacrificing self for state. To be Hathor meant being beautiful without threatening power. To be Sekhmet meant being fierce, but only when told. The goddess names were crowns made of chains, adorned with glory, bound with expectation. The power that wasn't theirs women did find meaning in these goddesses. They prayed to them, carried their images, found comfort in their stories. But the power of the goddess was abstract, symbolic, remote. When a woman gave birth safely, she thanked Taweret. When her child died, she begged Isis for mercy. When her husband struck her, she turned to Hathor for peace. And when nothing changed, she stayed silent. Because the goddess was divine. She, however, was not. The burden of sacredness to be called. Sacred sounds like a gift. But in ancient Egypt, it was often a curse. Sacred women were pure, which meant controlled, obedient, contained. Sacred women endured pain without complaint, loved without condition, bled without speaking, sacrificed without recognition, because to question was to dishonor the divine. To want more was to sin. They were mothers of gods, but never gods themselves. The afterlife's false promise. In death, some women were buried with amulets of Isis or statues of Hathor, their tombs painted with prayers for rebirth, protection, and peace. But most were buried in silence. No divine words, no golden mask, no monument, Their faith had been deep, their devotion real, but the goddesses they worshipped lived on in myth while they vanished from memory. In a society where family was identity, to be without it was almost unthinkable. Women in ancient Egypt were defined by their relationships: daughter, wife, mother. These roles provided structure, security, status. But what happened when those ties were broken? Divorce, abandonment, widowhood without inheritance, infertility, scandal, all could leave a woman untethered. And once she stood outside the circle of household and temple, her world narrowed to a sliver of survival. She became something Egypt never liked to see. A woman alone. Divorce in ancient Egypt. Lawful, yet damaging. It's true that Egyptian women had the legal right to initiate divorce. Either spouse could dissolve a marriage, no elaborate court process required. A declaration, a witness or two, a division of property, and it was done. But legality didn't protect from consequence. A man who divorced his wife might keep the home, the livestock, the land. If children stayed with him, the woman had little left. She might return to her father's home if he was alive. If not, she begged for space in a relative's courtyard, and if she initiated the divorce. Her shame was even greater. She was accused of rebellion, ingratitude. She risked being viewed as difficult, tainted, dangerous. Men moved on. Women moved out. Abandonment. The quiet divorce. Not every separation was formal. Sometimes, a man simply stopped. Coming home. A husband might take a new wife, move to another town for work, disappear during war or pilgrimage, and never return. A woman left behind in this way was not divorced by law, but abandoned in life. She waited, hoped, then accepted. With no male protector, she became her own keeper. She tended the fields alone, raised children with no income, watched neighbors look away. Some suspected she had driven him off. Others pitied her. No one helped. If she sought a new partner, her past followed her like dust in wind. Women without children, lost in lineage. A woman without a husband could survive if she had sons, but those without children, especially childless older women, they became truly isolated. There was no retirement, no pension, no social care. A woman who had raised children could hope they'd care for her in old age. A childless woman had no such expectation. She lived off charity, if it came. She worked until her body gave out. Sometimes she was taken in by a niece or cousin, but often she simply disappeared from record, her final years spent in the margins of someone else's home. Living on the edges of town, women cast out from family homes often found shelter on the fringes of towns and cities. They lived in mud brick shacks near riverbanks or temples. Some banded together, forming loose communities of widows, abandoned wives, unmarried elders, and cast-offs. These enclaves were not formal, not stable, but they offered a sort of silent sisterhood. Still, they were viewed with suspicion. Any woman living alone was suspect. She might be labelled a prostitute, a witch, or a thief. Children were warned not to wander near. Priests rarely visited. The gods stayed distant. But within these quiet shelters, women survived. Together, labour. Without protection. A woman on her own could not afford stillness. She might hire herself out as a washerwoman, cleaning the laundry of wealthier households. Or she became a grinder of grain, a fetcher of water, a preparer of food. Some worked in temples as servants, sweeping floors, pounding incense, baking bread for rituals. Others sold amulets or herbs at the edge of markets, their voices hoarse from shouting over younger vendors. She earned barely enough to eat, and often she slept beside her tools. No one called her by name. No one asked her story. Reputation, the wound that never healed. To be a woman alone was to be whispered about. No matter how honest, how hard-working, how modest, she was suspicious. Why did her husband leave? Why had no one married her? Why did her children not return? Why did she speak so little, walk so far, laugh so rarely. Reputation stuck to her like the desert dust, visible even when undeserved. She might be avoided at wells, pushed aside in crowds, priced unfairly in markets. Her real crime was not wrongdoing, but existing outside the expected mold. The refuge of the temple. Partial sanctuary temples sometimes accepted these women, not as priestesses, but as workers, a woman might find refuge as a weaver in temple workshops, a cleaner of altars, or a helper in sacred kitchens. Some temples had housing compounds for elderly women, especially those without family. This was the closest many came to stability in their later years. But even here, they were not equals. They slept in servant quarters, ate last, prayed from the back rows. Still, it was better than the street. They gave their labor to the gods, and the gods, at least, did not strike them down. Dignity in exile. Some women, despite everything, found a strange strength in exile. They answered to no husband, feared no in-laws, raised their voices when necessary, gave advice to younger girls who still believed in fairy tales. They knew where to find clean water, how to mend without linen, which herbs soothed pain. They became the old woman at the market, stall who knew too much, the quiet figure who remembered war, famine, flood, and how to outlast them all. Their dignity did not come from status, but from endurance. They were forgotten by their families, but not by the land. Long before formal medicine existed in sterile chambers and scrolls, there were the women who healed. They were midwives, herb collectors, bone setters, pain easers, comfort givers. They held the knowledge of generations, not in libraries, but in calloused hands and quiet minds. These women were healers not because they were taught, but because they remembered, because someone had once helped them survive. Yet history, written by male scribes, left most of them behind. The midwife's role, life and death in her hands. A midwife in ancient Egypt was not a priest, not a noble, not a scholar, but she held, perhaps the most sacred power, helping life cross from one world to the next. She did not wear robes of gold or carry scrolls. She wore simple linen and carried herbs, oils, string, amulets, and skill. She knew how to ease labor pains with warm compresses and whispered songs. She helped women squat on birthing bricks, used her fingers to reposition breech babies, tied cords when the umbilicus bled too long. She cleaned, comforted, and mourned, often all in one night. There were no guarantees. But if a woman had a midwife, she had a chance. Training. Without books, there were no universities for midwives, no official schools. Knowledge was passed down orally, mother to daughter, midwife to apprentice. A girl might begin as a helper, fetching water, boiling, linens. She would watch births before assisting in them, learn the herbs by scent before by name. It was learning through presence, not theory. And when the elder healer died, the knowledge passed only if someone had stayed close enough to learn it. This wisdom was fragile, perishable, and often it died with the women who carried it. Herbalists and medicine women. Healing wasn't limited to childbirth. Some women specialized in herbs, roots to stop bleeding, leaves to ease coughs, oils for burns, poultices for wounds. Their gardens were their pharmacies, their hands the mortar and pestle. They dried garlic and juniper, brewed potions from date pits and pomegranate rind, mixed honey and frankincense for infected cuts. They didn't know modern biology, but they knew what worked, and their reputations spread quietly. People came to them at night, not because they were ashamed, but because they feared being overheard by priests or physicians who might accuse them of practicing magic. For many women, the line between healing and witchcraft was thin and deadly. Accused of magic, guilty of knowledge. Wise women walked a dangerous line. They were respected for their skill, but feared for it too. A woman who knew too much, healed too well, or failed to save a patient could be accused of witchcraft. If a midwife lost a baby, rumors might spread that she had cursed it. If a healer's tonic failed, she was blamed, not the illness. If she healed a man the priest could not, she was dangerous. Accusations of sorcery were not trials of truth. They were expressions of discomfort with women who held power. And once accused, she had no defense but silence. Healers in the temple. Shadows. Some temples employed women in healing roles, especially in the service of deities like Sekhmet, goddess of plague, or Bastet, goddess of protection. But these were exceptions. Most temple medicine was male-dominated. Women might serve as assistants or herbal gatherers, but rarely as physicians. Still, temples were places of learning. Some wise women loitered near them, overhearing rituals, watching treatments. They adapted what they could. Others simply watched the animals, learning from injured dogs, sick goats, dying cattle. Nature was a patient, unjudging teacher. The gods had their priests. The people had these women. Emotional labor, grief, counseling, and compassion healing wasn't only physical. Midwives sat with women after miscarriages. Herbalists soothed dying elders. Some women, especially older ones, were known as listeners, grief bringers, death guides. A widow with no one else turned to the old woman in the alley. A mother whose child wouldn't stop crying whispered to the healer in the market. A frightened girl with bleeding. She didn't understand came at night, ashamed but hopeful. The healer touched foreheads, held hands, breathed with the grieving. She had no spells, no silver, only presence, but often that was enough. Unpaid, unnamed, unrecorded. The work of these women was rarely rewarded. Some received small coins, leftover food, scraps of cloth. Others were repaid only with respect or hope that someone would help them when their time came. Their names were not written in scrolls. No statues bore their faces. No tombs told their stories. They lived as shadows behind survival. And when they died, their knowledge vanished. Unless someone had stood close, listened carefully, and carried it forward. Legacy in the bloodline. Some healing women became matriarchs of knowledge. Their daughters and granddaughters followed them. Their names, at least within the family, lived on. Your grandmother knew how to bring fever down. Or, my mother once stopped a bleeding with honey and prayer. These women lived in memory, not history, in stories, not in stone. Their knowledge was not seen as science, but it was. Their hands were not called sacred, but they were. They stitched the body and the spirit, and they did so alone. In ancient Egypt, death was not the end. It was a threshold, a passage into the field of reeds, a perfect mirror of life, where the just could farm without toil and reunite with loved ones. But entry into that afterlife depended on one essential element: remembrance. The dead lived on in memory. Their names were spoken in rituals, carved into tombs, painted on coffins. To be remembered was to exist. To be forgotten was to die a second, final death. And for countless Egyptian women, especially the poor, the cast-off, the ordinary, that second death came quickly. Tombs for the Few. Egypt is famous for its tombs, pyramids, mastabas, painted chambers of kings and queens. These were reserved for royalty, priests, and wealthy elites. Their names endured for millennia, their faces painted with ochre and lined with gold. But the vast majority of women had no tombs. Most were buried in shallow pits or communal graves, wrapped in linen if fortunate, naked or in coarse cloth if not. Their bodies were not embalmed with care, their hearts not preserved in canopic jars. No painted ceiling shielded them, no protective spells lined their shrouds. They passed into the duat with no map, no name, no farewell. The cost of remembrance names cost money. To inscribe a tomb wall with a name required hiring a scribe. To place an offering table with the dead required stone, labor, time. To have even a basic wooden stela marked with your name Your lineage, your simple plea, "May my soul live forever," was an investment. Most women could not afford this. Even those who had families often relied on sons or husbands to honor them. A woman who died before her husband might be included in his tomb, but if she died alone, her memory depended on the goodwill of those left behind, and goodwill fades quickly in poverty. Married into oblivion, some women were remembered, briefly, through their husbands. Beloved wife of Horemheb, mother of the steward, lady of the house. These titles appeared on tomb walls, but they were attachments, not identities. Few of these women had their full names recorded. Fewer still had their stories told. Their role in death, as in life, was secondary, decorative, adjectival. Even when named, they were often posed beneath their husbands, smaller in size, eyes lifted. To him, in eternal devotion. He looked ahead. She looked at him. Widows and the forgotten. A woman without a surviving male relative was in danger of erasure. Widows who had no sons to preserve their memory often disappeared from the record. Their belongings were scavenged, their graves untended, their spirits uninvoked during festivals. Without someone to speak their name, their soul wandered. In some beliefs, the ka, the spiritual essence, needed offerings to survive in the afterlife. Bread, beer, prayers. These were provided only if someone remembered. A forgotten woman was not just lonely, she was starved, thirsty, unanchored. Burial. Inequality. Who got the spells? The famous Book of the Dead was not a book. It was a collection of spells written on papyrus or tomb walls, guiding the soul through the underworld. But these scrolls were expensive, reserved for nobles, priests, and royalty. Most women died without access to these spells. They had no guide through the trials of the afterlife, no words to speak to Osiris, no map past the demons, no ritual formula to weigh their hearts. They entered eternity in silence, hoping the gods would understand their unspoken prayers. Names. Scratched away, in rare cases, women's names were intentionally erased. A queen who fell from favor, a wife accused of betrayal, a concubine who bore the wrong child. Their tombs were defaced, their stelae shattered, their images chiseled out of history. To destroy a name was to destroy a soul. These women were condemned to a spiritual death, one with no mourning, no chance of return. And the punishment was not public. It was quiet, permanent, final. No one wept for them because no one was allowed to remember them. The exceptions that prove the rule. A few women defied this fate. Amos Nefertari, honored for generations. Hatshepsut, whose reign was buried, then unearthed. Tyr, whose name appears beside kings. These women were powerful, political, dangerous, and even they were nearly forgotten. How much harder then for the midwife, the washerwoman, the mother of 5 who died in childbirth. Their names did not vanish by accident. They were never written at all. Memory carried in other ways. Not all remembrance required stone. Some women lived on in lullabies, in the shape of a nose passed to a granddaughter, in the stories whispered by fires. Your great-grandmother used to walk from here to the river and never spill a drop. These memories had no monuments, but they had power. They survived in hands that kneaded dough the same way, in voices that told old jokes, in eyes that watched children the same way she once did. This was memory as rebellion, quiet, resilient, real. We often speak of ancient Egypt as a land of marvels, pyramids, pharaohs, gold masks, and sacred cats. But beneath that grandeur lies a quieter truth. For most women, life was not a procession of rituals and silk. It was endurance, it was invisibility, and that truth, though buried in sand and time, still echoes. Because the struggle of ancient Egyptian women was not just their own, it was the foundation of a world built without their names. The pain behind the glory. We marvel at queens like Hatshepsut and Nefertiti. We admire statues of Isis and Hathor. We admire the poetry and the rituals, the temples and the medicine. But for every named queen, there were thousands of unnamed women. For every goddess honored in marble, a midwife buried in an unmarked grave. For every scribe recording laws, a woman bending over flax, bleeding from her fingertips. The monuments of Egypt rise from the labor of women who were never meant to be remembered. Their hands shaped the world. Their names slipped through it like smoke, why it sucked, and why it was accepted. The injustice wasn't always obvious to them. Most women did not rebel. They did not see their lives as tragic. They worked, they mothered, they prayed, they obeyed, because that was the world they knew. Injustice is often invisible when it is ancient, when it is shared, when it is expected, but invisibility is not the same as peace. There were women who cried in corners, who watched their children starve, who feared the knock of their husband's hand. There were girls who flinched at the word marriage, who bled too early, too often, and no one wrote down their fear. Echoes in modern flesh. If their pain seems familiar, it's because echoes of it remain. Women today still fight to be believed, to be heard in courts, to own their stories, to name their traumas without being shamed, to give birth without fear, to grow old without vanishing. We are told we have come far, and we have. But still, there are women working without rest, raising children alone, healing others while no one heals them. Still, the unpaid labor. Still, the fear of walking home, alone. Still, the unmarked graves, ancient pain, modern scars, the power of remembering. Why does it matter what happened to women in Egypt 4,000 years ago? Because forgetting is the final cruelty. These women built civilizations, fed them, clothed them, birthed them, mourned them. Their silence was not chosen, it was imposed. Their suffering was not rare, it was universal. To remember them is to undo, even slightly, the theft of their stories. To say their names, even if we must invent them, is to honor the truth that history does not belong to kings alone. Reclaiming the whisper. This story is not about victimhood, it is about visibility. Yes, they were oppressed. Yes, they were silenced, but they also survived. They whispered to each other in dark rooms. They passed down herbs and recipes and lullabies. They found joy in children's laughter, in shared bread, in a moment of rest. They were never weak, only unseen. They were not powerless, only unrecorded. And now we record them, not perfectly, not completely, but with intention, so that future generations will know. They were here. The real legacy, the monuments remain, but so do the hands that shaped them. The words of priests survive, but so do the quiet prayers of women at dawn. The statues endure, but so does the echo of a mother's song, sung while grinding grain in the shadow of a pyramid. This is not just history, it is inheritance, and we are its keepers now. A dark room. A modern woman stands in a museum, staring at a linen shroud beneath glass. A placard reads, "Undocumented female burial, 18th dynasty." The woman presses her hand to the glass. Behind her, faintly, we hear the murmur of countless voices, women telling stories, laughing, weeping, working. They were forgotten, but not anymore.